The recruiter didn't even look up when he said it. "You're not Marine material." 17-year-old Darius Cole stood there in silence, fists clenched, heart pounding. Pride shattered. In one sentence, a man in uniform had dismissed everything he had fought to become. Raised in a broken neighborhood by his grandmother, Darius had survived poverty, violence, and loneliness, but not even those trials prepared him for the sting of rejection. From the institution he had idolized since he was a child, he walked out of that recruiting office not with a plan but with a promise. He would become everything they said he couldn't. The first time Darius Cole walked into the recruitment office, he wore a threadbare hoodie, borrowed shoes, and eyes full of determination. 17 years old, raised by a single grandmother, in a rough Baltimore neighborhood. He had never known comfort, but he knew discipline. Every morning since he was 9, Darius woke before the sun to run laps around the block, shadowboxing his demons. The Marines weren't just a dream, they were an escape, a purpose. Behind the desk sat Staff Sergeant Reynolds, a square-jawed man with decades of service etched into his brow. He scanned Darius's paperwork with a cold, clinical gaze, then looked him up and down like a cracked tool unfit for the field. "You're not Marine material," he said flatly, sliding the file back. "Try the Army, or maybe stay home. This life ain't for you." Darius didn't argue. He just stood, swallowed the humiliation, and walked out. But he never forgot the sting of those 5 words. Over the next 2 years, Darius doubled down. He worked 2 jobs to support his grandmother and finished high school with honors. He trained harder weights, cardio, combat drills, anything he could find online. When he turned 19, he tried again. A different recruiter, a different office. This time, no one told him no. Boot camp broke boys, but it didn't break him. Instead, it sharpened his pain into purpose. Over the next 2 decades, Darius Cole didn't just become a Marine, he became the Marine. He survived 6 deployments, earned the Navy Cross for pulling 3 wounded men from a burning convoy in Kandahar. He became a sniper, a recon team leader, then a force recon captain. His name whispered across units as a quiet legend. And then, 20 years after that first rejection, he stood at the Pentagon, dressed in a crisp uniform heavy with ribbons and combat decorations. A ceremony was being held to promote him to lieutenant colonel. After the handshakes and applause, a line of Marines and dignitaries came to pay respects. Then came a familiar faceholder, gray at the temples but unmistakable. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, now long retired, stood at attention before him. Time had softened his eyes. Without a word, he raised his hand and gave Darius a salute. Not the casual courtesy between colleagues, but the firm, deliberate salute of a man acknowledging his superior. Darius returned the salute, then leaned in quietly. "I was Marine material," he said, voice calm. Reynolds nodded. "You were. More than I ever could have seen." Later that evening, Darius stood alone on the Pentagon steps, watching the flag ripple in the wind. He didn't feel triumph. He felt clarity. Sometimes the fire we need is lit by someone who doubts us. He smiled, because some men are built, and others like him are forged. 20 years later, inside the Pentagon, rows of officers and dignitaries stood in formation as the medals on Darius Cole's chest reflected the overhead lights. The room was silent as the announcement rang out. "Effective immediately, Lieutenant Colonel Darius Cole." Applause erupted, but one man stood stiffly at the end of the line, older now, slower. Former Staff Sergeant Reynolds. His hands trembled slightly as he raised them to salute, not as an equal, but as a man saluting the Marine he once told would never make it. Darius returned the salute, then leaned in close. "I was Marine material," he said, voice calm, but heavy with history. Reynolds swallowed hard. "You were more than I ever imagined." That night, Darius stood alone outside the Pentagon, the wind tugging at his uniform, the stars high above him. He thought of his younger self barefoot on cracked pavement, sprinting toward an impossible dream. He thought of every doubt, every door slammed, every battlefield he'd walked through to prove one thing: you don't need someone to believe in you. You just need to believe enough to keep going. Because sometimes greatness isn't recruited. It's refused, rebuilt, and risen.